In 200 meters, turn left onto Rue Robert. Now turn left onto Rue Robert. In 200 meters, turn left onto Chemin Jean Adam. Now turn left onto Chemin Jean Adam. In 200 meters, stay straight to take the QC15 sud ramp toward Montreal. Now stay straight to take the QC15 sud ramp.
As far as to put down his name and the state of affairs on Basilisk Station on the list of next month's official questions.
Oh-ho!
Alexander shook his head with a small smile. The official questions list gave the opposition a way to force the government to allow open and generally partisan discussion of things it might prefer to avoid. A prime minister could refuse to answer an official question only if he certified with the backing of the Crown and the Chief Justice of the Queen's Bench, that answering it would jeopardize the kingdom's security. Even then, the government had no choice but to permit individual members of Parliament to debate the question in secret session. Potentially, that made the list an extremely effective parliamentary weapon, but it was a double-edged sword, and the timing could go wrong, like now. Under the unwritten portion of the Manticoran constitutional tradition, a question could not be withdrawn, even by its author, once it was on the list. Clumsy, clumsy, he murmured thoughtfully.
Absolutely. Since he can't withdraw it now, Harrington's given us the perfect shot to ram through amendments of the original Act of Annexation. But that's only true if she's still senior officer on the station when the question comes up.
Well, I know Jim certainly doesn't plan to pull her, and Janacek can't. If Jim and Lucian Cortez stand firm, I think they will.
And if Young gets himself back on station?
Now that, Alexander admitted, is a more ticklish point. Jim and Lucian can't stop him from going back any more than Janacek can relieve Harrington. Not unless they want to come out into the open and declare war on the Conservatives. And if it comes down to an open showdown between them and the First Lord, they'll lose. They have to, or the whole concept of civilian control of the military goes out the airlock.
That's what I was afraid of, William sighed. Our spies in the enemy camp suggest that High Ridge is pressuring North Hollow to suggest his son bite the bullet and go back without his ship if he has to.
Won't work, Alexander said firmly. In a sense, he was SO in Basilisk only because his ship was assigned there and he went with her.
What do you mean?
William looked puzzled, and his brother's grin was wicked. That's always been one of the problems with the picket there, Willie. You see, officially, there is no Basilisk station to command. Not in the sense that there's a Manticore Fleet District or Griffin Fleet District, thanks to the Act of Annexation and Janacek's own policies. That means the picket's SO isn't in the same position as, say, a squadron commander. In the case of a squadron or an official station or district, a commanding officer is responsible for all operations in his designated command area and for every ship assigned to it. But thanks to the mishmash we've actually got in Basilisk, where there's no formally specified command area at all, Young's primary responsibility was to act as captain of his own heavy cruiser. It was only the fact that he was the senior RMN officer present that made him the picket commander. Or, to put it another way, Warlock is his designated command area, and his authority beyond her hull is restricted by her current physical location and functions on a strictly ad hoc basis. Oh, if he'd detached himself from Warlock to Fearless in the first place, the Admiralty wouldn't have objected. In fact, that's what he ought to have done. But when he officially delegated the SO's job to Harrington by removing his ship from the picket, he released himself unilaterally from any responsibility for or authority over Basilisk Station until his refit is completed. Technically, he can't go back without Warlock, without absenting himself from his post, unless Lucian cuts him orders to that effect. I can't quite see Lucian doing that. And I can see Jim getting awfully stuffy about the letter of the regs all of a sudden if Young tries to reassume command there without Warlock.
But how close is he to getting Warlock back from the yard? William asked anxiously. Can he get back there with his ship before Wallace's question comes up?
Right. Alexander sat back and drummed on the desk blotter with the fingers of both hands. He thought for several seconds, then shook his head. He just might at that.
All right. William drew a deep breath. You understand, of course, that this has to be completely unofficial, Hamish.
Alexander nodded, already guessing what was coming next.
The Duke has asked me to tell you that Her Majesty's government would find it most convenient if Lord Pavel Young is not on Basilisk Station for the next month.
I understand, Willie. Alexander gazed at his brother for a few more seconds, then shrugged. I'll see what I can do. Unofficially, of course.
Thanks, Hamish. We appreciate it.
Anything for a good cause, Willie. Alexander said. See you later. His brother nodded, and Alexander cut the circuit. He sat in pensive thought for a moment, and then punched a scramble-coded number into the comm. The screen lit with a wait prompt, then cleared to show a sleep-tousled James Webster.
Who? Oh, for God's sake, Hamish, can't you let a working man sleep?
Afraid not. I just got off the screen with Willie, and he's got a little job for us. Alexander outlined his conversation with his brother in a few short sentences, and Webster's eyes widened while the last vestiges of sleep faded from them.
Don't want much, do they?
He asked sardonically when Alexander finished. No more than we do. This sounds like the perfect opportunity to catch the opposition with its shorts around its ankles, Jim. From what Willie's told me in the past, a pretty firm majority in the Lords is impressed enough by Harrington's accomplishments to stand with the government, and we already had a strong majority in the Commons. If Wallace has to ask his question while she's still acting as though, the government can respond using her policies as its basis, not Young's, and make her look like exactly what she is, a decisive officer fully discharging the Navy's responsibilities for the first time in 20 years. And they can argue that what's needed is to see to it that other officers are in a position to do the same thing in the future. If that happens, we can actually turn Basilisk Station into something that works instead of a half-assed nightmare. Harrington's done her part for us. All we have to do is keep Young here in Manticore and off her back a little longer.
Hamish, I'll be the first to admit I dream about a chance like this, but just how do you propose to pull that off? I can guarantee Lucian won't give him permission to quit his ship, and that I won't let him go back without her, but Warlock can't be all that far from completing her refit.
I know, but you know, Jim, even the best refit crews can fall off their stride from time to time.
I don't think this is something the First Space Lord should know about.
In that case, don't tell him. Alexander flashed a sudden boyish grin. Don't tell me you don't sometimes forget to mention things to your official persona.
It's been known to happen from time to time,
Webster allowed.
What won't I be telling myself this time?
I'm going to go up and have a little talk with Craig, I think. Can I tell him that you've blessed my mission? Unofficially, of course.
Unofficially, but fervently,
Webster agreed. Good. Thanks, Jim. Sorry to have dragged you out of bed.
Don't worry about it. Just do a good job on Craig.
Oh, I will, Alexander agreed with a smile. I will. Vice Admiral of the Red, Sir Craig Warner, commanding officer of Her Majesty's Space Station Hephaestus, stole the time from his schedule to meet the private yacht personally. longer ago than he liked to remember, a very young Commander Warner had found himself embroiled in a duel over a drunken insult to the good name of a lady. His captain at the time, a most well-born nobleman, had disapproved rather strongly of the practice of dueling, but when the circumstances and graphic nature of the insult had been explained to him, he had astounded Commander Warner by offering to act as his second. The lady in question was now married to Vice Admiral Warner and the mother of his 4 children, and his then-captain had become a very close friend and godfather to Warner's oldest son. So when Hamish Alexander asked for a few hours of his time, Warner was only too happy to oblige. Now, the yacht completed its docking maneuver, and Warner stepped up to the personnel tube to greet his visitor. It was an unofficial visit, and Alexander was in civilian dress. He'd been on half pay since the first week Sir Edward Janacek took over the Admiralty, so no formal courtesies intruded.
Good to see you again, Craig.
Alexander said, shaking his hand firmly.
About ready for a real space-going command again? They also serve who stand and weld,
Warner replied solemnly.
On the other hand, I did hear something about a battle squadron that needs a good flag officer.
Really? Alexander grinned. When?
I've got another 7 months here first, unfortunately. Few ships likes me more than I'd like them to. It's because you're so damned efficient,
Alexander teased as they headed for the personnel councils.
True, too true. But what can I do for you, Hamish? Want a tour of my little workshop?
Maybe later. In fact, I'm sure I would later. But first, I need to bend your ear for a few minutes. In private. Warner shot his superior a very sharp look indeed, then shrugged and waved him into the capsule.
In that case, let's take this to my office,
he suggested, punching buttons, and Alexander nodded. The capsule deposited them at a terminal less than 50 meters from Warner's office, and the 2 admirals walked down the passage side by side, chatting amiably and harmlessly. Warner's aide and personal yeoman were waiting, but their boss shooed them out and closed the hatch firmly behind them. Then he gestured Alexander into a comfortable chair, poured drinks, and sat down behind his desk.
And now,
He said,
what's all this unofficial visit about, Hamish?
"It's about Basilisk Station," Alexander replied, and Warner blinked in surprise.
More specifically, it's about the possibility of finally getting our hands untied there. Interested? Very. But where do I come in?
"Well, Craig, it's like this." Alexander leaned back to cross his legs and reported his conversation with his brother yet again. Warner listened intently, nodding his understanding of each point, then tipped back his own chair.
So you and Admiral Webster want me to hang Young out to dry?
He said when Alexander was done.
More or less, and very unofficially.
How about it? Can you swing it for us?
I don't know, Hamish.
Warner plucked at his lower lip, frowning in thought, then shrugged.
The thing is, I have to admit I've already been dragging my heels ever since word of Harrington's activities started getting around, just to watch the little bastard squirm. He hasn't been getting the work priorities he thinks he should, and he's been in here every other day or so to complain.
Does that mean you've used up all your tricks?
I don't know.
Warner thought some more, then turned to his terminal and punched up the work files on HMS Warlock. He frowned at them, whistling tunelessly between his teeth as he paged through the screens of data, and Alexander possessed himself in all the patience he could manage.
Well now,
Warner murmured after several minutes.
that's interesting.
What? When Warlock first arrived,
Young wanted a complete overhaul of her forward Warshawski tuners. In fact, he was pretty strident about it, but as you know, few ships, meaning me in this instance, has to sign off on anything that big.
He looked up with a wicked grin, and Alexander smiled back with suddenly dancing eyes.
And what was your decision, Admiral Warner? I didn't give him one, Admiral Alexander. From what I can see here, he's good for another 8 to 10 months hypertime on the tuners he's got before he even approaches mandatory replacement wear. I refused to give him an answer mainly just to be a pain in his arrogant ass, but I doubt I'd authorize it under normal circumstances with that much time left on the components.
Ah, but under these circumstances?
Why, I think I might just find it in my heart to okay the work after all,
Warner said generously.
Good. But will he bite, do you think? I thought you said he's been in here trying to get you to expedite. Oh, he has. And I'm almost certain he'll say no thank you if I make him an offer at this point. But there are ways, Hamish. There are ways. Such as, well...
Warner switched off his terminal and turned back to his friend.
I think the first step will be to hold the good news that I've decided to authorize his requested work until the end of this watch. Young's been spending a lot of time dirtside, hitting the landing night spots while Commander Tankersley, his exec, does all the work. No love lost there, by the way. And while he's out bar crawling, he leaves his comlink home, lets his message service handle any calls. So if we give him time to clear out, then authorize the work, we'll have a full watch and a half, 10 hours minimum, to hit our stride before he gets back. I imagine we'll have his Warshawski sails spread all over the slip before he knows a thing about it.
Tankersley won't smell a rat and warn him.
As I said, there's no love lost between the two of them. Tankersley's a fairly decent sort. I don't think Young's attempt to shaft Harrington sits very well with him, and you can't be exec to a man like Young without getting to know exactly how useless he really is. Under the circumstances, I sort of doubt Young's explained his real motives to him either, so Tankersley can play the uninformed but earnest exec to the hilt if he wants to. I imagine he'll screen Young all right, but probably only to leave a message with his service, and not one with any special priority.
Warner tapped lightly on his desk for a moment, then nodded to himself.
Won't hurt to make sure, though. My aide's not just good-looking, she's a very bright young woman, and she's been spending some off-duty time with Tankersley. That's one reason I figure he must be all right. Cindy wouldn't waste her time on him if he wasn't. Would it be all right if I have her mention to him that I'd appreciate his keeping his next progress report to Young a little vague?
We can't involve Jim or the government, Craig, Alexander warned.
If you're wrong about him, you'll be the one it comes back to haunt. I don't think I am wrong. And I'm perfectly willing to run the risk for something like this. Hell, who needs a battle squadron? Carol would rather have me planetside for good anyway.
Warner spoke lightly, though both of them knew the loss of his next command, or even half pay, was not merely possible, but probable if any of this became official knowledge. Their eyes met for a moment, and then Warner smiled.
Don't sweat it, Hamish. I'll pull it off. And once we get Warlock's forward hull opened up, I guarantee she won't leave dock for a good 7 weeks. Long enough. Long enough, Alexander agreed. And thanks. Don't mention it. I never liked his father either. And Carol will be delighted when she hears about this. North Hollow was after her before we were married, you know. No, I didn't. I wondered why you were so ready to dislike his son, though. Hell, that ancient history didn't have anything to do with that. Well, not much. This little creep is a disgrace to his uniform all on his own.
Warner sat for a moment longer, running through his plans, then nodded and stood.
Well, that's that,
he said with undisguised satisfaction.
And now, while I wait to put my nefarious plan into effect, why don't I give you that tour? Then we can finish up with supper and the flag officer's mess before you head back home. Sounds good to me,
Alexander agreed, and the two admirals headed for the office hatch once more.
By the way, how are the kids?
He asked as they stepped through it.
I saw Carol last week, but we didn't have time to talk. Oh, they're fine. Sandra just made commander, and it looks like Bob's got a shot at ATC early. Keith and Fred are still in school, of course, and neither of them seems interested in the Navy, but...
They walked down the passageway, chatting cheerfully. Chapter 23. Medusa was still the most boring-looking planet she'd ever seen, Anna reflected, brooding over the main visual display once more, but it was beginning to seem appearances could be deceiving. She remembered something she'd read once, some ancient curse from old Earth about living in interesting times. It made much more sense now than it had when she first read it. She hid a sigh, walked across to her chair, and eased herself into it without officially taking over the watch from McKeon. Her brain was busy. 2 days had passed since Hauptmann's visit. 2 whole days without a single new disaster, which was almost enough to make her skin crawl with anticipation. Not that there hadn't been interesting developments. Dame Estelle's sulphurous description of her interview with Countess New Kiev's courier had been one. Honor had never imagined the genteel, composed resident commissioner could be so elementally enraged. Dame Estelle had looked ready to bite pieces out of the furniture, but as Honor had listened to her account of the meeting, she'd understood perfectly. It seemed New Kiev was feeling the heat from the financial community in general, and apparently from the Hauptmann cartel in particular. From Dame Estelle's remarks, Honor was beginning to suspect that the big Manticoran merchant cartels had contributed rather more heavily to the Liberal Party's political coffers than she'd ever thought. The notion of an alliance between the parliamentary advocates of increased welfare spending and the captains of industry seemed a bit bizarre to Honor, but something was certainly giving them an awful lot of clout with the opposition, for Countess New Kiev had decided to turn the screws on Dame Estelle to propitiate them. Honor had been astounded to learn from the commissioner that New Kiev had been told in unambiguous terms to keep her hands off the Navy's operations on Basilisk Station. That must have been a rude shock for her, Honor told herself with secret delight, and it reinforced her own suspicion that someone well up the chain of command approved of her actions. It was also, she reflected, the first time since the Basilisk annexation that the Minister for Medusan Affairs had been told, rather bluntly, she gathered, that her authority ended at the outer edge of the planetary atmosphere. It was a long overdue assertion of the fleet's authority and responsibility, although, given the officers and ships normally assigned here, she had little faith it would last. But it was holding for now, and New Kiev didn't like it a bit. More, it sounded as if her authority, even within her own planetary bailiwick, had taken a beating. Honor hadn't quite understood the gleam in the commissioner's eye once she stopped ranting and started speculating on the political situation back home. Of course, Honor didn't understand most of the machinations that went on inside the Parliament of Manticore. She vastly preferred the Navy, where the chain of command was at least generally clear. Whatever infighting went on between factions and power groups. But Dame Estelle did seem to grasp the Byzantine rules of the game, and she appeared convinced that something deep, complex,
and probably drastic was going on beneath the surface, and that whatever it was boded ill for Countess Nukiyev. Honor could follow some of her reasoning, for as Dame Estelle had pointed out, Nukiyev, as one of the leaders of the opposition, held her present post only because the Ministry for Medusan Affairs was traditionally assigned to the Liberal Party as some sort of quid pro quo left over from the original tortuous annexation fight in Parliament. But there were limits to how far from the government line she could stray without losing her position, and it seemed she'd reached them, for her messenger had arrived in Dame Estelle's office with suggestions, not directives. The commissioner hadn't cared for those suggestions at all, and as far as Anna could decipher them, they seemed to have consisted entirely of variations on a single theme. Dame Estelle should remember the commercial importance to the kingdom of its great trading houses. She should strive to adopt a more conciliatory tone when dealing with them, and mediate between the Navy's overly rigorous application of the commerce regulations and the cartel's legitimate concerns over sudden and abrupt changes in the regulatory climate. Above all, she should remember the transitory nature of our custodial presence on Medusa and avoid any actions which would anger the natives or those who would someday trade with them as equals. And of course, she should strive to abate the possibly overzealous manner in which the present senior officer on Basilisk Station seemed to be wielding her powers over the remainder of the star system. It had, Anna reflected, sounded like the most mealy-mouthed, double-tongued case of interstellar arm-twisting she'd ever heard of, and its timing had been unfortunate. Dame Estelle had been back in her office for less than 10 minutes after a visit to the Government House Hospital, where the worst injured of her wounded NPA troopers had just died, when Nukiyev's courier caught up with her, and she hadn't been in the mood for it. She'd snapped the unlucky messenger's head off and sent him home with it under one arm, and a detailed account of the nature and severity of recently discovered violations of Her Majesty's Medusan Protectorate's laws under the other. And, she'd told Honor with grim delight, she'd concluded her report with the observation that the discovery of those violations had been made possible solely by the dedicated, professional, persistent, and outstandingly successful efforts, both in their own right and in association with the NPA, that was a direct quote, of Commander Honor Harrington and the crew of HMS Fearless. Under the circumstances, Dame Estelle had added she had no intention of striving to abate Commander Harrington's activities and every intention of aiding and abetting them in any way she could. And if Her Majesty's government disapproved of her intentions, she would, of course, submit her resignation. The fact that her offer to resign hadn't been taken up seemed, in Dame Estelle's opinion, to validate her conclusion that Nukiyev was in some sort of trouble back home. Honor wasn't so certain about that, but when she added it to the evidence of unanticipated support from her own superiors, she had to concede that the commissioner might just have a point. The problem, of course, was that the support might well vanish if she and Dame Estelle couldn't carry through and deliver either the parties behind the drug lab, and almost certainly the new weapons as well, or else demonstrate that those criminals' activities had been stopped once and for all. And the unhappy truth was that they had achieved exactly nothing further since Hauptmann and the courier had taken themselves back through the Basilisk terminus to Manticore. Honor half reclined in her chair, crossing her legs and steepling her fingers under her chin, while Nimitz napped on the chair back, and tried to think of anything else she might have done, or, for that matter, might still do. The tap on the power collector was, she was almost positive, a dead end. Oh, she had no doubt it had been installed when the collector was first put in by the Hauptmann cartel, but despite McKeon's savage counterattack on Klaus Hauptmann and the investigations no doubt underway back home, it was unlikely anyone would ever be able to prove precisely how,
If some highly placed individual within the cartel had ordered it, any records which might once have existed had very certainly been destroyed long since. And if someone had slipped it in when the prefabricated collector components were assembled here in Basilisk, it could have been any one or two of scores of people involved in the project. In either case, the chance of ever figuring out who'd done it was astronomically remote. But Dame Estelle was right about one thing. Tapping off of the government's own backup collector had shown a degree of arrogant self-confidence which sat very strangely with how meticulously the lab itself had been hidden. There'd been no need to tap that particular collector, even if they hadn't wanted to use their own collector. A geothermal plant, or even a simple hydro generator, installed in the volcanic springs 2 kilometers from the lab, could have provided the needed power. And it could have been run in by wire without the betraying risk of beamed receptors and relays. It was as if their opponents had a split personality. One side of them hid the presence of their drug-making facilities with obsessive care, but the other ran utterly unnecessary risks that almost seemed to flaunt its nerve by stealing power for those same facilities from its enemies. And, she thought grimly, there might even be a third personality, given the way the lab had been blown. That had been a terminally stupid thing for any criminal organization to do. The NPA would never give up looking for whoever had ordered it done. It was almost like a deliberate challenge, designed with malice aforethought to goad the authorities into the most violent reaction possible. The problem was that none of it made sense. Not only did the bad guys seem to be going off in half a dozen directions at once in their planning, but
In
the
2
very span of the
kilometers,
operation
take
was
exit
absurd.
1 in on the left toward
Dame Estelle was
QC40
right.
Est.
Whatever these people were after, it wasn't the profits from drug running or selling guns to the natives. It smacked of some organized off-world covert operation, but what was its purpose? Arming the Medusans and feeding them drugs that inspired violence had all the earmarks of an effort to engineer a native insurrection, yet no possible Medusan uprising could hope to defeat the forces Manticore could put into Basilisk to stop it. There might be a great deal of bloodshed before it ended, but most of the blood would be Medusan, not Manticoran, and the most likely upshot would be a powerful, permanent military presence on Medusa in place of the lightly armed NPA troopers now stationed there. Unless, of course, whoever was behind it, she very conscientiously avoided assuming it was the Republic of Haven, might be hoping for another response entirely. It was always possible that a bloodbath on Medusa would be
Now take exit 1 in on the left.
and wake such revulsion in Parliament as to enable the
In 300
anti-annexationists
meters,
to
keep
finally
left
get
to take
Manticore
QC40
entirely
Est
off
toward
the planet.
Quebec.
It struck honor as unlikely in the extreme, but
Now keep left to take QC40
Yet,
Est.
even if that worked, it would never get the kingdom to renounce its claim on the Basilisk terminus of the junction, and what good would it do anyone, even Haven, to simply get the NPA off Medusa? No, there was something else going on here. Something she and Dame Estelle were both missing, but something definitely linked to off-world interests other than a purely domestic Manticoran criminal operation. Honor was certain of that, even if she couldn't quite make the next connection in the chain, and that meant... Captain? Honor twitched up out of her reverie at the sound of Captain
In
Papadopoulos'
2
voice.
kilometers,
Her
take exit
surprise
73 on the right toward QC19, Avenue Christophe Column. Now take exit 73 on the right. Now stay straight to take the ramp toward QC 19 North. In 200 meters, turn right onto Avenue Christophe Column.
Confusing a little bit there.
Now turn right onto Avenue Christophe Column.
Not quite.
In 200 meters, turn left onto Rue Saint-Grégoire. Now turn left onto Rue Saint-Grégoire. In 200 meters, turn left onto Rue Garnier. Now turn left onto Rue Garnier.